Today we are on the farm of John and Diane Cameron here in Bainbridge, southern Chenango County, New York. And Rob DeClue, area conservationist with the Chenango County Soil and Water Conservation District, will be asking John and Diane and his family some questions about weed management in their cropping and grazing system.
A lot of graziers, kind of wrestle with the whole issue of weed management in terms of how it's going to affect the success of their efforts and the performance of their animals, especially like dairy animals that have a higher nutritional plane. In terms of that topic for your operation here, I mean, what is your definition of a weed?
A weed is probably, what's left over, which the cows will not eat, or something that invades the field, and they won't eat it. I mean, dandelions and milkweeds are both. They continue to get worse, and they take up a lot of space, and they're not very. The animals won't graze them, so they're definitely a problem.
So again, in a grazing context where the animals are basically eating their own feed versus a field that's a hay field that's mechanically harvested, you've got a plant in maybe the same plant in either situation, but if it's a problem in your hay field, is it necessarily a problem in the pasture?
It's probably more of a problem in the pasture, being it's not mixed up and won't be eaten, where the hayfield it would be mixed in or chopped for silage or baleage, or where in a pasture they select what they eat, and when it's done rotationally the animals are moved and them species are still left there. So
okay, so maybe some other factors come into play in terms of whether they're going to eat a particular plant that ordinarily you wouldn't think is desirable in a hayfield, like the stage of growth, if it's young and tender versus if it's mature and more stemmy. Are there particular plants that, and again in a grazing context, that are the real headaches for you on your particular operation? I mean, what's the worst weed you have to contend with?
Well, right now we have always had a challenge with milkweed, and clipping it doesn't really seem to help. And just this year we've actually started selectively spraying for milkweed. And other pastures where we have done new seedings, weeds have really not been a problem. But other pastures which have been permanent pastures, where maybe they weren't grazed enough, certainly last fall because of the hurricanes and the wet weather, and the pasture season ended because of mud.
You mentioned a whole number of things that kind of trigger further questions from me, and one is you talk about the differences between traditional pasture versus say a meadow that's been converted to grazing, at least a part of the growing season. You want to get into that a little further? I mean, again, the traditional pastures seem to have the toughest situations for you to work with those weeds and kind of keep them in check.
Yeah, because normally when we'll spray Roundup or and 2,4-D where we're going to seed a pasture, and usually that'll pretty much eliminate the weed problems for at least the next 3 years. But traditionally you try to manage the pasture to keep clover, and most everything we're going to spray is going to take the clover out.
Okay, so one of the other points that you brought out is that when you basically reestablish a new seeding in an area that's basically going to be grazed at some point, what approach do you use, and how do you think that affects your ability to control the weeds, either existing or future weeds? Do you conventionally fit up the ground, plow and disc and harrow, or do you use some less invasive tillage or no-till?
Well, traditionally in the past, all the pasture reseeding we've done has been no-till, and most successfully, would be sprayed in the fall and no-tilled in the spring. And then last year we did some grazing corn, which is tillering corn, and we used the corn herbicide. But all our pastures are all done, no-till. We don't. And we've had good success doing that. So,
you mentioned that at this point, you basically establishing new seedings or reinvigorating, maybe weak stands with a no-till drill. Do you feel that that has any benefit in terms of avoiding scratching up, say, through conventional approaches to preparing a seed bed where there's what they call weeds in the seed bank there from prior years of buildup and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would first we wouldn't have the time to plow up, pastures, and I think with using no-till, I mean, really, the weed bank isn't the issue, where it definitely would be if we would plow it, but between erosion and rocks and time, we just wouldn't have the time to do it any other way than no-till, and we wouldn't do it. So
one of the other topics is this concept called integrated pest management, where there's a diversity of approaches used for, in this case, undesirable plants, that you really don't want in the fields, be it grazed or whatever. And so do you apply any of those techniques, cultural, biological, chemical? You mentioned, using herbicides there, mechanical control, clipping. You've mentioned you do clippings and stuff like that. So I assume that you basically utilize some of those techniques.
yeah, I mean, clipping is a very important part of our pasture. What you normally find in the springtime when we pasture cattle, they can keep ahead of the paddocks at a very successful rate and do it very good. And then when you get to early June, they grow so fast and they'll head out. So that's been a challenge there. And when it heads out, the cattle just don't like to eat it. But
So it sounds like, when you decide to clip a particular field, it's not necessarily exclusively for weed control. It's kind of resetting the
Right.
vegetative state
Yeah.
of the desirable plants that you want your animals to basically forage on.
right.
What kind of equipment do you use to clip? Because there's various types of machinery that farmers can choose from and or have on
Yeah.
hand.
Uh, Most of the fields we use just a 12-foot disc mower on, which is the same mower we mow hay fields with. And then for some fields which are rougher, we have a 8-foot brush hog we use, and that cuts it very short.
Okay, how tight are you able to get with your brush hog?
Oh, we right down to 2 inches.
Oh,
I mean,
so
2-3 inches,
pretty
as good as the mower.
Now, in terms of, I just say identifying a plant if you're not familiar with it, or getting information on, what an appropriate way to get a good control of a weed, what kind of resources do you normally tap into? Either printed information, personal information, or, either on the internet or whatever. I mean, where do you go for that kind of help?
Well, my son's a plant science major, and I usually look to him, and he's got a wealth of resources he goes to, and he'll explain it to you.
Herbicide labels tell you what the herbicide will clean, which weeds it'll control. Cornell website has resources on it for how to control each weed, and pictures and descriptions of each plant.
So, I basically identifying, if you're not familiar with it already, some kind of a plant that seems to be a troublesome thing in the grazing system. You normally hit up the internet and start to go through and key it out, or somehow, hey, that photo kind of seems to match it in the description, the growth habits and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then you get a handle on what it is, and it's, and then match it up to whatever control options are available. So Cornell website seems to be one of the more helpful ones.
Yeah.
Good. Any other resources or other farmers, that you cross paths with and asking information, or just your college education and textbooks and stuff like that?
Just well, part of it's other people's experiences with weed control, and then part of it's just learning for yourself.
Have you seen a change in the weed composition, or the type of weeds, or how vulnerable or prolific they might be, compared from the older approach to grazing to the current more intensive approach, or not?
I'm going to say they're probably worse now because we really haven't controlled them, and in the past the pastures were more permanent and they would really chew them down, and then we would clip them once in the summer. We really saw very little weeds, I think. But the pasture never really was very productive. Where today, we're taking cows off and then the weeds continue to grow, and then we're regrazing the field and the weeds continue to grow. The worst thing to do is, have a pasture with weeds and don't clip it for a year or two, and then you will have a big problem.
Have you ever attempted to spot spray or felt the need to spot spray where you've got an isolated infestation of a weed that you don't want to?
I think we just have started spraying pastures.
You're familiar, there's one approach to using an herbicide selectively, and that's what they call wick applicator.
Yeah.
On the front of say a four-wheeler or a small horsepower tractor, getting something tall like thistle or milkweed where it's above the canopy of the desirable plants, and seems to be another technique or tool to use. So
I don't know, we have a spot sprayer on a four-wheeler that we do use, and we sprayed underneath electric fence, and that's something that needs to be redone a few times during the summer.
Is there any particular tips or suggestions that you might want to offer that I haven't asked through questions to the audience to help them on this topic of weed management?
I don't know, I think the best thing to do is, to learn from other people and your neighbors, and try something on your farm and see if it works. There's no better way to do it than that, and try something different, And
So basically do a little experimentation on a new technique that you haven't tried before, see how it pans out. If it's good, you can expand upon it. If it isn't, you just reject it and go on.
Right. Don't try to turn your whole grazing program over in 1 year. Try a little segment. If that works, then continue, make another segment next year and continue it that way, rather than to go whole hog and start the whole program from ground zero.
It sounds like
Because if it doesn't work for you, you're not going to be happy. So
and reduces your risk if you start small.
right.
Well, thank you all for your time and effort and all the information that you've been able to share with myself and the audience here. We hope you have a great season and are able to keep on top of those weeds.